It began with a single defiant rhythm, the sound of 1,000,000 hammers striking sun-baked mud, a heartbeat of clay and fire that drowned out the wind. They didn't want the heavens, they wanted the throne of the stars. In the fertile shroud of Shinar, Nimrod did not look at the earth to see where his people would walk. He looked at the clouds and saw a ceiling that needed to be shattered. Labana, they whispered, brick, a word that became a prayer, a weapon, and eventually a tomb. They were a people of one tongue, one mind, and one terrifying dream, to build a ladder of silt that would allow them to look God in the eye and never have to blink again. Movement 1. The Shinar Protocol. The world was too wide, and the memory of the water was too deep. For generations, the descendants of the three sons had lived in the shadow of the mountains, their eyes always nervously scanning the horizon for the return of the gray clouds. They were a people defined by their fear of the vertical, of the heights that had once been the only safety, and the depths that had been a grave. But as the centuries bled into one another, fear curdled into a strange collective iron. They no longer wanted to hide from the heavens, they wanted to conquer them. Nimrod, a man whose shadow seemed cast by a sun only he could see, stood at the edge of the Shinar plain. It was a vast, flat expanse of alluvial gold, a canvas of mud and reeds that stretched until the earth curved away. "The mountains are a prison," Nimrod's voice carried through the camp, a singular tone that everyone understood. At this time, the world had no dialects, no accents, no hidden meanings. Every word was a sharp, clear stone. "We huddle in the caves of our fathers like animals waiting for a storm that will never come again. We are scattered. We are weak. But here, the earth is soft. Here we can bake the ground itself into a new mountain, one that will not crumble, one that will reach into the dwelling of the Most High." The command was simple: Labana, brick. The industry that followed was a fever. They didn't just build, they manufactured a god. The invention of the kiln changed everything. They were no longer dependent on the irregular shapes of hewn stone. They were creators of the uniform. Millions of rectangular blocks, each a twin of the other, began to pile up at the center of the plain. They used bitumen, the same black, sticky soul of the earth that had once sealed the ark, not to keep the water out, but to bind the bricks together. As the first circular tier of the foundation took shape, it was more than an architectural feat. It was the first time since the garden that humanity felt they didn't need a savior. They had the kiln, they had the pitch, they had each other. The foundation was so wide that a man could walk for half a day and never leave the shadow of the first level. As the smoke from 1,000 kilns choked the sky, the Shinar plain transformed into a landscape of fire and soot. They were building a name for themselves, and in the center of that rising circle of clay, the silence of the heavens felt less like a blessing and more like a dare. The first ascent, the gravity of ambition. By the time the fourth tier was completed, the tower had developed its own weather. The heat of the Shinar plain stayed trapped at the base, but as the masons climbed the winding outer ramps, the air grew thin and spiteful. At 300 cubits, the wind no longer whispered, it shrieked. It clawed at the loose linen tunics of the laborers and threatened to pluck them from the edge of the world. In the camps below, a life was measured by the weight of the clay it could carry. A terrifying new philosophy had taken root among the foremen. The brick was holy. There is a legend whispered in the dust of those days, that if a man fell from the heights, his brothers would barely pause their rhythm. But if a brick fell, if one of those kiln-fired, bitumen-sealed blocks tumbled into the abyss and shattered, the wailing could be heard for miles.
A man could be replaced by a son, but a brick took time, fuel, and fire. The construction had become more human than the humans. At the center of the ascent was Aton, a master mason whose hands were permanently stained black by the pitch. He stood on the edge of the rising seventh tier, looking down. From here, the great city of Shinar looked like a scattering of gray ash. The massive kilns were mere sparks. "Higher!" the command came from the tier above. It was Nimrod's voice, filtered through the bronze speaking tubes that lined the central shaft.
"The mortar hasn't set," Eaton shouted back, his voice cracking. "The weight of the upper crust is pressing the life out of the lower layers. The clay is weeping, my lord." "Then let it weep," the tube hissed back. "We have reached the layer of the mist. We are piercing the veil. Do not look down, Eaton. Looking down is for those who intend to return to the dust. Are you a creature of dust or a dweller of the heights?" Eaton looked at his hands. They were cracked, bleeding into the bitumen. He realized then that they weren't just building a tower, they were building a ladder to escape their own mortality. They thought that if they got high enough, the rules of the earth, gravity, hunger, death, would simply cease to apply. That night, the first warning occurred. It wasn't a thunderbolt from the sky, it was a sound, a low, groaning vibration that started in the very bowels of the foundation and shivered all the way up to the clouds. It was the sound of the earth protesting the unnatural weight. For a moment, the thousands of workers on the ramps went silent. For the first time in a generation, the rhythm of the hammers stopped. In that silence, they heard the stars, and the stars sounded like judgment. But by dawn, the fear had evaporated. The pride of the one tongue was too strong. They told themselves it was merely the wind settling into the bricks. They picked up their trowels, they lit the kilns, and the tower grew another 10 cubits toward a heaven that was watching in terrifying silence. The oxygen of gods. The air at the summit had become a thin, silver ghost. On the 12th tier, the world below had vanished entirely. The builders no longer lived in the Shinar Valley. They lived in the vertical. They slept on narrow wooden pallets bolted into the brickwork, their lungs burning with every shallow breath. The sun, once a source of warmth for the kilns, was now a predatory eye that blistered their skin by day, while the nights brought a cold so sharp it could crack a fresh brick. Etan moved like a specter through the scaffolding. He was no longer just a mason, he was a guardian of the threshold. "We are breathing the breath of the spirits," the men whispered. Their eyes were wide, bloodshot from the pressure. Some claimed they could hear the music of the spheres, a high, whining vibration that made their teeth ache. In reality, it was the sound of the wind whistling through the millions of microscopic gaps in the masonry, but to a people drunk on their own divinity, it was the voice of the stars. The unity of the one tongue began to take on a darker hue. In the valley, having one language was a gift of cooperation. Here, in the thinning air, it became a tool of absolute surveillance. There was no room for dissent because there were no secret words. If a man felt a tremor of doubt, his neighbor knew it before the thought was even fully formed. To speak against the tower was to speak against the very air they shared. Nimrod rarely ascended now. He remained in the lush, oxygen-rich gardens at the base, sending his commands up through the bronze tubes. His voice, distorted by the long trek up the copper veins of the structure, sounded less like a man and more like a tectonic shift. "The cloud line is beneath us," the bronze tube roared one afternoon. "You are the first of the new race. The earthbound are gone. You are the skyborn." But the skyborn were dying. Etan found a young laborer, barely 20 summers old, slumped against a stack of bitumen-coated tiles. The boy wasn't injured. His body had simply forgotten how to pull life from the frozen air. "Etan," the boy wheezed, clutching a brick as if it were a holy relic. If we reach the top, will he be there? And if he is, will he be angry or just tired? Etan didn't answer. He looked out over the edge. For the first time he saw it, the great dissonance. The clouds below them weren't white and fluffy. They were dark, roiling, and heavy with the same gray moisture that had once drowned the world. He realized then that they hadn't built a ladder to heaven. They had built a lightning rod. The groaning vibration from the foundation returned, louder this time. It wasn't a settling sound, it was a pulse. The tower was beginning to lean just a fraction of a degree, invisible to the eye, but felt in the inner ear of every man on the heights. The weight of human ego was finally exceeding the structural integrity of the clay. "The mortar is bleeding!" a voice screamed from the far side of the ramp. Etan ran toward the sound. He found a section of the wall where the bitumen was being squeezed out like black blood. The bricks were grinding against one another, producing a fine red dust that clouded the air. He opened his mouth to shout a warning, to tell them to descend, to stop, to repent, but his throat seized. A strange sensation washed over his mind, like a veil being torn. He looked at his assistant and said, "The foundation is failing." But what came out of his mouth was, "Zigurat shulmu kima." The assistant stared at him, eyes wide with terror. "What did you say?" the assistant asked, but to Etan's ears the boy had said, "Babel el Shinu." The one tongue had fractured. The great silence was over. The chaos had begun.
The tower did not fall all at once. First, the concept of the tower fell. Etan grabbed the young laborer by the shoulders, shaking him. He tried to explain that the wall was buckling, that the bitumen was failing, that they needed to brace the eastern arch. He shouted the words he had used for 40 years, clear, sharp, Shinarite words. But as they left his lips, they felt heavy and oily, twisting into sounds that mimicked the screeching wind. The boy recoiled, his face contorting in a mask of horror. He didn't hear a warning, he heard a curse. He heard a guttural, jagged series of syllables that sounded like the grinding of stones. The boy opened his mouth to plead for help, but his voice had become a liquid, melodic trill, a language of birds and water that had no place in this world of fire and clay. Etan backed away, his heart hammering against his ribs. It wasn't just his ears, it was his soul. The mental bridge that had connected every human being since the first breath of Adam had been burned away in an instant. Chaos rippled across the 12th tier like a physical wave. A foreman swung a heavy bronze mallet at a mason, not because of a grudge, but because the mason had asked for more mortar and the foreman had heard a declaration of war. Tools became weapons. The unified rhythm of the hammers, the heartbeat of humanity, shattered into a million discordant fragments. "Halt!" the bronze tube screamed from below. Nimrod's voice was still recognizable by its cadence, but the words were a terrifying jumble of static and glottal stops. To the men on the heights, it sounded like the tower itself was mocking them. Then the sky finally answered. The dark clouds that had been hovering just above the summit didn't produce rain, they produced static. A massive, silent discharge of celestial energy struck the very peak of the ziggurat. It didn't explode, it vibrated. The frequency was so high that the kiln-fired bricks began to liquefy back into dust. The vibration traveled down the spine of the tower. Men who could no longer understand their brothers began to throw themselves from the ramps, preferring the certain embrace of the earth to the terrifying isolation of a world without words. Etan scrambled down the spiral, his hands slipping on the black blood of the bitumen. On every level, he saw the same nightmare. Mothers clutching children they could no longer soothe with lullabies. Architects weeping over blueprints that now looked like the scribblings of madmen. They were no longer a nation. They were a billion islands, drifting apart in a sea of noise.
As Eton reached the 5th tier, a massive fissure opened in the center of the ramp. The tower groaned, a sound of ultimate exhaustion. The earth, which had been silent during their arrogance, was now reclaiming the clay.
The descent was a slow, agonizing funeral. When Etan finally reached the soft dust of the Shinar plain, the world he knew was gone. The grand unity of the empire had dissolved into 1,000 frantic whispers. The valley, once a site of industrial triumph, now felt like a graveyard for a god that was never born. The great kilns had cooled. The fires that had burned for decades, turning the earth into stone, flickered out one by one. Without the one tongue to coordinate the fuel and the labor, the fires simply starved. Etan stood at the base of the massive ramp, his neck aching as he looked up. The tower sat like a severed limb, its unfinished peak jagged and raw against the bruised sky. It was no longer a ladder to the stars, it was a monument to the limit of human reach. Groups were already forming. It was a strange biological sorting. Men and women drifted toward those who shared their new peculiar sounds. A group that spoke in sharp percussive tones gathered their livestock and headed toward the cold mountains of the north. Those whose voices had turned into soft, sibilant whispers turned toward the humid deltas of the east. There were no goodbyes. How do you say goodbye when the word for farewell now sounds like a threat to your neighbor? Etan found himself standing with a small remnant. Their words were guttural and deep, vibrating in the chest. They looked at the tower, then at each other, and finally at the horizon. The fear of being scattered, the very thing Nimrod had used to drive them to build, had finally come to pass. But it wasn't a scattering of bodies, it was a scattering of the mind. As the sun began to set, casting the tower's mile-long shadow across the valley, Etan picked up a small, unbaked brick from the dust. It was soft, vulnerable to the rain. He squeezed it, and it crumbled back into the silt of the Shinar. Babel, he whispered. To him it meant gate of the gods, but to the rest of the world it would forever mean confusion. One by one the fires went dark. The people began to walk. They walked until the tower was nothing more than a thumb on the horizon, a needle of hubris in a vast, silent world. The silent prevalence that had once ruled the flooded world had returned, but this time it was a silence between hearts. The earth was wide again. The nations were born in the wreckage of a single word. The journey concludes not with a crash, but with a walk into the unknown. Humanity, once a single fist, was now a handful of seeds cast into the wind. The tower remained, a hollow shell, a skeleton of clay, reminding all who passed that while man can build high, he can never build high enough to escape himself.